Welcome to the Polycrisis, where we look at our interconnected crises, the whole being bigger than the sum of its parts. All the episodes for our first season, Electric World Order, are available now, and season 2 is in development. In the meantime, we have a special bonus season, Demand Destruction. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz has made this the biggest energy shock in our history. Each episode will discuss the implications and geopolitics of this crisis that's arisen from the war in the Middle East. I'm Kate McKenzie, a Sydney-based energy and climate finance expert.
And I'm Tim Sahai. I'm with Johns Hopkins University in the US, where I co-direct the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab. I'm speaking to you from my home in New York City. Military action has restarted between US and Iran. Missiles have been fired at American warships and Iranian boats. Iranian drones have attacked the UAE's Fujairah oil facilities. Last week, we had the shock announcement that the UAE was quitting OPEC. So how are these events connected? And what does this change at OPEC mean for the energy transition?
Let's start with the economics, and then we'll get into the geopolitics of this. So I'm going to kick off with the economics, or the oil economics, really, the oil strategy behind the UAE decision. This is a really big shock when it was announced. I was really, stunned, kind of like mid-sentence when I saw the headline. It comes about in a context, though, just in the kind of oil market, OPEC context, that has actually been evolving for a few years. So it's not just about the war. I think there are elements of the war that play into it. But just for sort of historical context, the United Arab Emirates has been unhappy about OPEC policy for at least a few years. They have felt that they are unfairly having to restrict their oil production to comply with OPEC's policy. And of course, OPEC, being a cartel, they want to operate in concert to support oil prices where deemed necessary or possible. The UAE is one of the most powerful players in OPEC, or was the really most powerful member of OPEC apart from Saudi Arabia. They're not like the biggest producer. They weren't even the second or third biggest. I think they were like fourth or even fifth, depending how you count Iran in that mix. But they did maintain some spare capacity, also like a pretty rich country. So that gave them a bit of leverage. And there had been this tension between the UAE and Saudi Arabia over whether to maintain production cuts or whether to just like pump. And that had been going on for a while. So
when you say spare capacity, like what is spare production capacity and why is it so important to oil economics?
So having spare capacity means you've got you can switch it on. We sort of talk about like, you can turn on a tap or something. Obviously, it's not that simple, but you could relatively easily start pumping more oil. And if you're a country or an oil producer that can do that, you, in a sense, you hold some cards in the game where everyone else, say the poorer oil producing countries, are just wanting to pump as much as they can because they just need the money right now. So they can't afford to be strategic and think long term. And that's been, which has been what Saudi Arabia in particular has wanted to do. This is part of the strategy of OPEC, really, but particularly for Saudi Arabia, wanting to sell less now in order to keep the price a little higher than it would have otherwise been and maintain, long-term demand for oil, or maintain their long-term revenue. It gives you more leverage as well. Like you've got an option there.
Yeah. I mean, I've always sort of spare capacity as sort of like the real power of the players in the cartel to really drive out their competitors, right? So if all of a sudden you decide to increase your production and you collapse oil prices, then pretty much everybody else gets screwed. And they really get the message who's the top boss in this cartel, right? And so the Saudis have really played that role, and they've tried to increase their capacity to drive out, the shale guys, for instance, right? Like in the 2020 crisis.
Yeah, exactly. And as we know, that was not very effective in 2020. But getting into the more recent history of OPEC, Saudi Arabia is again, around 2024, they were trying to implement and maintain some production cuts to, again, support the oil price, but it was not super effective. And UAE has been known to be producing above what it's meant to be producing under the quota system of OPEC and OPEC plus, and that's been a big source of tension. So Saudi Arabia actually started cutting. It gets a bit complicated when you talk about cutting back the cuts, or they started winding back or supporting, reducing the production cuts, i.e., expanding oil production last year. That was actually believed to be more about trying to discipline the non-compliant members of OPEC by, like you say, having this threat and saying we're going to wield this threat of increasing production and driving down prices if you guys don't fall into line more with our quota, with our restrictive quotas. But this gets into something I want to talk about more, which is this, what is the long-term strategy of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and why are they different?
So why are they different? I mean, I think that the picture you were painting was spare production capacity, something that the Emirates are sort of chomping at the bit to try and increase their production, and the Saudis are sort of holding them back, saying keep the quota. What else? What else is going on between the two of them?
Well, okay. So the reason they have this different perspective or different strategy is that for Saudi Arabia, well, there's three reasons really. Saudi Arabia is far more dependent on oil revenues for its own economic well-being and its fiscal position than the UAE, right? So Saudi Arabia has what is called a fiscal break-even target price for oil, which I think is around $80, and they actually sort of declare this, I think, fairly openly. Saudi Arabia can produce oil and make a profit at, way less than that. They can produce for, I think, around $10 a barrel, but they need the price to be quite a lot higher than that, because the whole way the country is structured, it's a big population. Obviously, it's, an autocratic regime, but you still need to keep your population happy. And in order to do that, they have to spend a lot of money on, nice, very nice sort of social supports and, well-paid public service jobs and all sorts of things. Whereas the UAE doesn't have that need. It's not so dependent on its oil revenues. It's a smaller country, smaller population. It's diversified away from oil a lot more successfully. And I think there's this other suggestion as well of their sort of longer term beliefs about the outlook for oil. Or
Yeah, I mean, I find that the most interesting part of this, which is this long-term belief of, that famous quote by that Saudi energy minister Sheikh Yamani, where he was like, the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. The oil age is not going to end because we have run out of oil, but because people find better, superior alternatives. And, it seems like the Saudis still believe in the oil age going on forever, while the Emiratis are profoundly sort of thinking of peak oil.
I don't know if it's so much a difference in belief as a difference in ability. I think both of them, and that quote, that's quite a famous quote in the oil world, that Stone Age, running out of stones thing. To me, that actually underscores how much Saudi Arabia has always feared, or has long feared, the end of oil demand. And that's why they don't want oil prices to be too high as well as too low, right? So it's a similar, I think that both countries have a very sort of healthy fear of the end of oil demand, or a peaking and decline of oil demand, as they should, because it's so important to them, right? But the UAE just has more flexibility. They just have more options. They've got, I think their dependence on oil revenue, their foreign income from oil revenue is something like 40 or 50% versus Saudi Arabia's is 80. It's quite a big difference between the two. Obviously, the UAE is this foreign international hub for all sorts of things, and Saudi Arabia hasn't done that so successfully. So I think it's the same fear, but expressed differently, like different strategies.
Yeah, but it almost feels very rational on the Emiratis' part to want to break out from OPEC, and I mean their picture seems very attractive because it's very simple. It basically says there's not that much oil to be sold in the world. Everybody's going clean and green. What do we do, lads? Let's just like pump the barrels. Let's pump the bloody barrels. And so if you just pump the barrels, you're going to collapse the oil price and you're going to have to learn to live with the lower oil price, which, nobody else in OPEC really can because, there are populous countries like Saudi Arabia or Angola or, these developing countries that are quite poor and haven't really diversified away from oil. And so the rest of them really want those prices high and production restricted. And it's that small sort of radical microstate UAE that can afford to just pump out and see the future more clearly in some sense and say, you know what, we might as well get a larger share of a shrinking pie.
Yeah, and it's also like how you view the future, right? And like whether, how do you value your revenue now versus in the future? Like it's partly a call about your own like economic status now, but it's also a call on your like it's also a decision about how you view the future of oil demand. And it's like, well, who knows? I mean, I think there's a lot of there's so many uncertainties about it that there's like obviously a rationality to just going, well, just sell as much as we can now for whatever we can get.
Yeah, I guess it's worth remembering that OPEC came about in 1960 when a bunch of newly sort of decolonized countries tried to assert control over their own oil that was largely run, owned, operated, managed by the actual cartel, which was international oil companies, your Shells and BPs and Exxons and etc. And so from 1960 to 1970s, 80s, these sort of newly independent oil countries became landlords and drove out the international oil cartel companies. And that's been this sort of way in which a lot of people, particularly in the West, view OPEC purely negatively, purely as a cartel that is sitting around, dictating production to keep prices high. And it's just a bunch of nasty people deciding prices. And I've never thought about OPEC that way. I've always thought about OPEC as part of the new international economic order, where a lot of resource-rich countries became newly independent and actually said, you know what, this is our resource, it's our oil. We decide to manage it for our people's benefits, for our infrastructure, for our tax bases, not for your profits. And obviously you could argue that over time that those newly independent countries ended up sort of enriching a small set of elites or whatever. But it is genuinely sort of a progressive sort of vision of owning the resources of your land. And in that sense, OPEC is, it's not progressive or regressive. It's just what it is. It's a choice between who should be extracting resources from your land, who should be owning the profits, and are your citizens going to get any welfare checks and shareholder dividend, or are the shareholders going to get all the dividends, right?
Yeah, who was it? I don't know who it was who described OPEC as like the most successful kind of post-colonial alliance, or I've heard it described like that, and ever since I heard that, I'm like I sort of think of it that way too. It's like, well, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Most successful, resource nationalism of developing countries. And, people have tried to create similar cartels with tin and bauxite and wheat and all kinds of other commodities, and they haven't really worked out. There's something special about oil in that it is in huge demand by the world, right? So you can really actually make a serious developmentalism through oil revenues in a way that you really can't out of other commodities, save maybe copper, in the case of Chile or something. But it's just been hard for developing countries to actually assert technological and political control of their resources.
Yeah, I mean, it's like ridiculously hard in most cases. But I just want to make one more point about this before we get onto the, the more geopolitical sort of bigger picture, which is kind of ironically, though, it's some of the smaller and poorer members of OPEC who have not been faring very well under OPEC quota regimes in the last few years. There was a really interesting story in Bloomberg News about 2 years ago about how the jostling between Saudi Arabia and UAE over quota production allocations basically led to like the poorer African members, I guess primarily at the time it was Angola, Nigeria, can't remember who else, they had to bear the brunt of quota production cuts, right? So that UAE could kind of prevail. It's ironic. Like these are the countries that have far less of a far less powerful hand to play in oil markets globally and within OPEC. And they're the ones that are not being lifted up by OPEC. And then Angola is one of the countries that subsequently left OPEC. And understandably, I guess, compared to Nigeria, I think Angola has somewhat more, quite a bit more, diversification away from oil. So I guess a bit like UAE, in UAE relative to Saudi Arabia, whereas Nigeria is really an oil, like they're really an oil economy. Angola's got a couple of other irons in the fire there, like in terms of resources and exports. But yeah, and who else? Ecuador also quit. Qatar, that's a bit of a different case. But, it's just interesting that that some of these countries are really not seeing their interests served by being in this cartel with these bigger, more powerful oil producing countries anymore.
I mean, I've been sort of just thinking about what are the ways in which we, the rest of the world, thinks about the Emirates, right? So the UAE, I don't know, you talk to somebody in America or in London, in one of these big rich places where the Emirates have a lot of financial wealth stashed away, and they're investing in the AI companies, and they're investing in the banks, and they're just, they're this big like checks that everybody wants. And so there's one picture of the Emirates, which is fabulously wealthy, sort of rentier state, which is a bunch of kings that own the oil wealth, and they enjoy total autonomy from the state. There's no parliament to hold you account. There's no people, practically speaking. It's like 1 million citizens and 9 million non-citizens that live in your kingdom. So that's one picture of the Emirates as a rentier state. There's another picture which is just, it's a really tiny state. It's like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and it's like 1 million nationals and total about 9 or 10 million people. So that's a micro state that doesn't really rely upon its citizens to do most of the work. It relies upon foreigners, and those foreigners are largely hyper educated subcontinental people, people that I grew up with in Bombay, people from Pakistan. These are the people who are the skilled professionals in the Emirates. My aunt was there as a doctor in Dubai, earning herself a pretty penny after retirement from the Indian Army. And then the third way in which people think about the Emirates is it's just a playground for the world's rich people, right? So a bunch of tax dodging expats, that's the picture that people have, and a lot of illicit money and oligarchs from a bunch of different countries, and owning land and property and stashing away their wealth in the Emirates. And I guess the last way people think about it, or at least I think about it, is it's a real creature of the Anglo-American Empire, right? The Emirates were created by the Brits and the Americans. And they really, to this day, are very much part of the Anglo-American sort of protection imperial world. And in that role, they have become really, really close to the Israelis and to the Americans, particularly over the last 5 years, and become sort of a part of this sort of anti-Iran sort of coalition, which is U.S., Israel, and UAE, in a way that Saudi Arabia has sort of tried to steer a bit clear of. And that divide between the Saudis and the Emiratis as to sort of which geopolitical bloc are we sort of truly in. And the Saudis have tried to seek a détente with Iran. They negotiated a détente with Iran under sort of Chinese mediation. The Saudis are trying to sort of find sort of military pacts with Pakistan. They signed a sort of a mutual a self-defense sort of pact with Pakistan, which is if we get attacked, you come to our aid. And they've been sort of trying to negotiate sort of nuclear weapons from Pakistan in case the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. Can you guys, Pakistan, help us out with the nuclear weapon, etc. So the Saudis have been sort of playing a diplomatic game, which is not just being part of the US Israeli bloc, but actively trying to seek other partners, and in particular, sort of a détente with Iran in a way that the Emirates are absolutely not. And these things matter because as soon as the war started, the Iranians obviously knew that a bunch of warships and a bunch of planes and missiles that are being hurled at Iran are coming out of the Gulf kingdoms, and so they relentlessly bombed UAE, right? So I think something like 3,000 bombs, missiles, drones were launched by Iran into UAE, and that's where the Emirates sort of military defense pact with the Israelis really helped, something called the Abraham Accords that was signed in the first Trump term, where they basically had a anti-missile sort of umbrella, air defense umbrella, that knocked out most of those Iranian drones and missiles, not all of them, which, many of them hit the American bases and the radar installations and the ports and the oil facilities, etc. So they've been under relentless attack by the Iranians since the war began.
How much of this UAE aligning more with Israel and the US, how much of it is down? You seem to be attributing it to this kind of like the fact that the Emirates are these like Western sort of Anglo financial playgrounds, that's part of it. But is it also like the geographical proximity that they feel more exposed to Iran? And
oh yeah, they're just across the Gulf, right? So you shoot at something with your short range missiles, which the Iranians have built a huge buffer capacity of these short range missiles, and they can keep shooting at them till kingdom come. While it's very hard for the Iranians to shoot long range missiles, which they have very much fewer in their arsenal, to shoot them all the way to Saudi Arabia or all the way to Israel. So they've really pummeled each of the Gulf kingdoms that are just across the Gulf from them. And that's, part of their asymmetric escalation strategy by the Iranian military, is to cause pain to the Gulf kingdoms, and in particular to disable the American air bases in those Gulf kingdoms, so that these attacks by the US and Israel cannot take place onto the Iranian homeland. So that's sort of part of the logic of why you would expect the Saudis to be a little bit okay with Iran, while for the Emiratis, at least for the Emirati royal leadership, Sheikh MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, they want the Americans and the Israelis to finish the job and do regime change in Iran, and that's going to be very tricky because they basically would have to make a bet that the Americans and the Israelis are indeed capable of disarming Iran and getting rid of their missiles and drones, which, 2 months into the war, it seems like is just not winnable.
But and that seems to be the bet that they're making, right? And there's so there's two other elements to this, at least, which I'm curious to know what you think about them right now. When the announcement came out that the UAE was leaving OPEC, I know there was a bit of chatter around about this report that had come out a week earlier that the UAE was seeking a dollar swap line with the US. Okay, and I should try and explain the significance of a dollar swap line. We wrote about this a couple of years ago, but dollar swap lines are very valuable to any country. Most of the countries that have permanent dollar swap lines are the rich countries of the world, but it's something that developing countries and any country that's facing the prospect of like some kind of run on its economy, basically like the equivalent of a bank run on your economy, or a plunge in your currency. It's something that you really want to have because it means that you can get you can swap your own currency for dollars, which is the currency that really counts when things are bad. So the report that the UAE was seeking that has been was linked to the OPEC decision. I don't know what you think about that Tim. But then the other thing is, obviously the Yemen and Sudan, these kind of like other theatres of conflict between, or sort of proxy conflict between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But yeah, on the dollar swap line, and the UAE kind of, really kind of going all in, I guess, on a US alliance, like financially and militarily.
Yeah, I mean, the Emirates are part of the GCC. They have a currency peg against the US dollar. And so if they want to defend that peg, they might just sell their US treasuries. And if you sell a bunch of US treasuries, maybe you might want to tell the Americans, hey, we are planning to do this. We would rather not sell a bunch of our treasuries. Like, do you guys want to help us out? To which the American Fed can respond, no, you're perfectly fine selling off your treasuries. Like, it's okay for you to do that. You should go first to defend your currency with your US treasuries rather than asking us for a swap line. So basically, there's been this negotiation between the Emiratis and the US Fed. And the US Fed is, at the end of the day, a technocratic body that is not going to make a political decision such as, well, you seem to have gotten yourself in a pickle, and you're in a geopolitical pickle and you're asking us for help. But there's another wing of the US state, which is the US Treasury, which is acutely just underneath the US government and US administration, that can just make a political decision. Yes, you are our friend. Yes, you are in a pickle, and therefore we should give you a temporary sort of swap line where you can exchange your dirhams for dollars. And so, you could imagine that as part of sort of a far-reaching sort of bargain between the Trump government and the Emirati government, which basically says a quid pro quo, which is you exit OPEC, you ramp up production, you bring oil prices down. That's going to really help me in my midterms. And I might win my re-election campaign in the midterms, but you need to bump up your production. At which point the Emiratis would say, yeah, sure, we'll do that. Can we have these swap lines, please? Or can we have this fund from the treasury, so a few $1 billion to help out a friend? So that is the kind of political calculation, which is purely a sort of a geopolitical, financial, statecraft, whatever you want to call it. But it's clearly a mix of economic motivations and geopolitical or political motivations, which, is exactly what we wrote about in that piece that you were referencing, the New World Order piece, which is the dollar is never just about the dollar. It's about the US sort of political position, or imperial position, if you want it that way, in the world. And, the largest wards of the IMF, which are the countries that the IMF sort of gives these massive dollar loans to. And it's all places that are hugely of geopolitical significance. It's Egypt, it's Argentina, it's Pakistan, So these are huge countries in geopolitically sensitive parts of the world, where the IMF, has routinely intervened against the advice of a bunch of IMF technocrats. But you always get the sense that at the end of the day, it's the shareholders of the IMF, with the US having, largest sort of veto power in the IMF board, that can make these calculations. So in that sense, it's not all that surprising that something like this is going on. And it has caused a big kerfuffle, right? So the American technocrats are really pushing back and saying the Emirates are exactly the wrong kind of entity to give dollar support to, because they have an enormous stash of dollar treasuries that they should be using.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too far down like a rabbit hole of like the politics of dollar swaps, but it's not like purely technocratic decision, is it? Even when it's made by the Fed, it's like, it's interesting, like which countries got dollar swap lines during the global financial crisis, and then which ones have sort of permanent ones. And even when these decisions are made technocratically, like there's still a lot of politics and a lot of like history, and because like did the really debt distressed countries get them during COVID? They were the ones that really needed them, like some of these like lower income countries that were coming up against the prospect of defaults, and that would have really shored them up, right? Like these, African countries, they didn't get them. So, I mean, they're not strategically significant, but I guess they're not also like not technocratically significant or whatever.
But I really think that this idea of economics and security, like what are the two wings of the American state that have a lot of autonomy in making decisions? And you basically realize that there's the dollar that underpins American power in the world, and there's the American military that underpins power in the world, right? And the dollar is under the control of the Treasury, Fed, kind of US London kind of nexus. And the military, is something that is this sort of extended thing that can give you air defense cover. So if you think about the Emirates, like they need both the dollars and they need the air defense cover. And they go to the Pentagon to get, or the Israelis to get that air defense cover, and they go to the US Treasury or the US Fed to get the dollar swap lines. So in that sense, we really have to start thinking about energy, economics, and empire together, which is what we have done in this conversation. And when you have a giant petrostate like the Emirates under attack, all of these parts of the American state have to be mobilized to defend them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add as well as the three, as well as the like dollar, military, and energy dominance. There's also like the tech stack as well now, isn't there? Basically, yeah, ways in which the US, in particular, but not just the US, but mostly the US is able to exert discipline and control over other countries is through these interdependencies, these things that are really hard to kind of, for any country to, or almost any country to sort of cut themselves off from. I mean, China being one that's probably like the most, has the most agency in that regard, and the most preparedness to exercise it. All right. So, what about this? What about these Yemen and Sudan proxy wars, and how does that, like, how is the tension between the Emirates and Saudi Arabia playing out there, and how does that, like, what's the connection there with Mohammed bin Zayed, the Saudi, the UAE's ruler, MBZ? Can you elaborate on that for us, and like how does that fit into what's going on now with the war?
Yeah, I mean, it has the character of a sort of a Shakespearean play. Like, you really have to think about, these like kings with a lot of power, drunk on a lot of power, and their rivalries and their courts, and, cooking up schemes to remake the entire Middle East. That's really how you got to think of Mohammed bin Zayed. And there's not been too many profiles of him in the English press, and that's largely because of Emirati sort of dark money in the US and UK. But there was a wonderful profile of him in the New York Times in 2020, and the title is Mohammed bin Zayed's Dark Vision of the Middle East's Future. And it paints him as this extremely ambitious king who has a plan to reshape the entire region's future. And he's the one whose protege is Mohammed bin Salman, the young Turk king of Saudi Arabia, who was a crown prince and is known to be his protege. And together they've hatched a lot of plans. In 2013, they together helped the Egyptian military crush the Arab Spring that had elected the country's first elected Islamist president in 2013. In 2015 in Libya, they step into the civil war and they defy the UN embargo. They get into the civil war in Somalia and become a power broker in the Horn of Africa. And then he joins the Saudi war in Yemen, which was against the Iran-backed sort of Houthi militias. So, these two kings have really operated together. So it's their kind of falling out in 2019, 2020 with the end of the Yemen war, when the Saudis basically realized that they can't crush and defeat the Houthis. And the Emiratis are, basically determined to continue to intervene in the civil war in Yemen. And, they've been backing the RSF in the civil war in Sudan. So those are now two giant wars in Yemen and Sudan that have displaced millions of people, besieging cities, starving civilians, where MBZ has indeed played a very, very dark role as a power broker. And the Saudis have been sort of on the other end of those conflicts, backing, the other side of those wars. And so this kind of friction between them in oil is really part of a larger breakdown between the Saudis and the Emiratis on what is the future of the Middle East and North Africa and the Horn of Africa.
Okay, so like really simple question though, aren't they both like broadly interested in stability? Is this just coming down, if they've kind of previously been pretty good allies, is this just coming down to strategic differences, or is this more of a direct rivalry around who is the most powerful state in the region?
I mean, there's definitely a personal rivalry and personal animosity, as you might expect, between a protege and his erstwhile sort of supporter. But there is, as you pointed out, a deeply economic difference between Saudi Arabia that wants to modernize and diversify the kingdom, has 50 million mouths to feed, and the Emirates that are, a much smaller place where the king has a lot more autonomy and can do basically what he wants. And so the differences between them are grounded in both personal animosity, rivalry, different visions for the future. And, the Yemen civil war was a huge difference, where Yemen borders Saudi Arabia and is really far away from the Emirates. And so at some point, the Saudis basically realized they need to come to a deal with the Houthis. And that kind of backs into this question about, can the Saudis live with a dominant Iran in the Persian Gulf, while the Emirates absolutely cannot and may be determined to go down fighting?
Yeah, it's so much about like how they each see their sort of like long-term survival, isn't it, by the sound of it? And then the different, like, it's really fascinating how much just the different population sizes that they each need to support plays into this as well. And then, the relative oil wealth and non-oil wealth that each of these two countries have.
Yeah, I mean, and how they use their oil wealth, right? So that oil wealth, particularly going into London and particularly going into the US and really propping up, the Trump regime, where MBZ, has made a huge effort to bribe and lobby a bunch of people in the Trump court, including his son-in-law and so on, and trying to curry favor with the AI lords in Silicon Valley by giving them an open checkbook for their data centers of their dreams. And so there really is you really, as I said, it's like a Shakespearean kind of a play that we need to be thinking in terms of, and definitely not narrowly only in terms of oil and economics.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, it just goes to show that, yeah, we can't just view like the oil part of this in isolation, and we can't view the war in isolation either. It's all like there's so many interconnected things, like we're always saying. All right, you've been listening to episode 2 of our bonus season of the Poly Crisis. I'm Kate McKenzie.
And I'm Tim Sahai. We publish a newsletter about the political economy of climate change, amongst other things. You can sign up for that and find out more about us at thepolycrisis.org or in our show notes.
Our producer is Sarah Allerley. Russell Stapleton composed our excellent music. Bethany Stewart is our sound engineer. And Sarah Allerley is also our executive producer.